So this is kind of a big deal. Everybody's talking about your review. So just to set the stage, could you briefly summarize what is the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which is quite a few decades old, and how it became so influential?
Yeah, so the serotonin hypothesis was first proposed in the 1960s, and it is the idea that depression is due to a deficiency of serotonin in the brain. And the hypothesis was popularized in the 1990s by the pharmaceutical industry when it introduced a line of antidepressants, the SSRIs, that are thought that increase serotonin levels and were therefore thought to work by rectifying the underlying serotonin imbalance that was proposed by the serotonin theory of depression. So the SSRIs were developed on the basis of the serotonin theory of depression, and they were believed to work in the way that the serotonin theory predicted. And so from the 1990s onwards, there was this huge marketing campaign which marketed the SSRIs very much in conjunction with this idea that what they were doing was rectifying an underlying serotonin deficiency, boosting your serotonin levels. There were lots of advertisements, direct-to-consumer advertisements in the United States, putting across that message, and there were online websites run by the pharmaceutical industry that also put that message across, that were available to everyone, you know, in different countries. And so people came to hear and came to believe that depression was caused by low serotonin, and that this could be put right by that this problem, that this brain abnormality could be corrected by an antidepressant. There was also a big campaign, a marketing campaign directed at doctors, so doctors were also given the same message at the same time as being, you know, directly encouraged to prescribe these antidepressants.
This is what most people know as the chemical imbalance theory.
Yes,
most
exactly.
people refer to it as a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Yes, and it was referred to as a chemical imbalance in a lot of the marketing in the 1990s.
So, but it seems that there were already doubts about the validity of this hypothesis ever since it started, and there has been previous studies and previous reviews checking the validity of this hypothesis and the efficacy of SSRIs, of the antidepressants that were marketed as a solution to depression based on this theory. So what makes your analysis different and relevant in this case?
So people have been suggesting, at least since 2005, probably a bit earlier than that, that actually the research on serotonin wasn't consistent and didn't convincingly support the serotonin hypothesis. So for a long time, there's been that suggestion out there. And when that suggestion was made by a couple of American researchers in 2005, some psychiatrists responded by saying, oh, you know, we don't really believe it anyway. Yeah, we don't think it's just a simple chemical imbalance. But the message still carried on being promoted to the general public. We've had a couple of doctors on British prime time on the BBC, one was on the BBC, one was on ITV, telling the public that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the last few months, one in the last couple of weeks. So the message still continued to be put out to the public. Now, the reason that I wanted to do this research was that there was no paper before ours that really collected together all the research. So people were sort of aware that maybe the studies weren't consistent, but no one had really got all the different strands of research on serotonin together and really looked at whether the studies were positive or negative or inconsistent or what they were saying. So that's what's new about our study. We got together all the all the different overviews and meta-analyses from all the main areas of serotonin research in order to be able to make a pronouncement on the current state of the evidence for links between serotonin and depression.
So for most people are not familiar with the terminology. So an umbrella analysis is basically a meta-analysis of meta-analysis.
Yes,
am I right?
Yes.
So,
yeah. So we did an umbrella review, and you're right, it's a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, but we also we did sort of 6 umbrella reviews because we actually looked at 6 major areas of 6 of the major areas of research in serotonin, and did a systematic review of all the meta-analyses in those different areas.
Yes. What's the total number of cases that some of the evidence for all the reviews that you took into account for your meta-analysis?
So we included 17 studies altogether, and the genetic studies were very large. They were using genetic data bank studies. We looked at studies of the serotonin transporter gene, which has been suggested to be associated with depression. So those studies involved tens of thousands of people. The largest one was over 100,000. The non-genetic studies involved a total of around about 6,000, or it might be 7,000 people. I can pop upstairs and check in a minute. Sorry, my paperwork's upstairs.
No, it's fine because it's not a small number of cases.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a lot of evidence that's accumulated. Also, like you said, you took a look at to some examples that were particularly useful in disproving this serotonin hypothesis. One of them was the genetic studies, and the other one was the tryptophan depletion studies. So can you go a little bit more into detail about what were these cases that ultimately gave you a counter example to the evidence that was presented as part of the serotonin hypothesis?
Yeah, so the tryptophan depletion studies are experiments that have been conducted for the last 30 years, which give people a special amino acid drink, which is meant to lower levels of serotonin. I should just qualify that by saying that it probably lowers levels of serotonin, but it may do some other things. So people are not totally certain, you know, whether this is a pure measure of lowering serotonin. Anyway, that's the idea, that's the theory. And this drink is given to volunteers who are not depressed, and then their mood is measured afterwards, a few hours afterwards, when serotonin is meant to be at its lowest levels. So the idea was that that this method of, it's called tryptophan depletion, this method of lowering serotonin would induce depression in people who didn't have it. But those studies don't show that. The studies with volunteers show that there's no effect on mood, that there's no lowering of mood. There was the last meta-analysis was done in 2007, and there was a small effect in people who had a family history, a very small sample of people who had a family history of depression, but overall there was no effect in volunteers. And then we looked, because that meta-analysis was done so long ago, we looked at the last 10 trials that had been published on this in December 2020 when we did the searches, and none of those showed any effect in volunteers either. So there's quite a lot of data that shows that lowering serotonin through this tryptophan depletion method does not cause depression.
Are there examples to the contrary that people with high serotonin levels are nevertheless, with very high serotonin levels are nevertheless depressed?
So we looked at the serotonin receptors, and we looked at studies that have been done on the serotonin transporter. That's the protein that removes serotonin from the nerve synapses where it's active. And both of those areas of research showed very inconsistent and weak findings. So they looked at different areas of the brain using brain imaging techniques, and in some areas of the brain they found lower levels of serotonin receptors, for example, and lower levels of the serotonin transporter, but in some they didn't. but lower levels of the serotonin transporter would actually imply higher levels of active serotonin, because the serotonin transporter removes serotonin from the place where it has its action.